Hi, I'm Stephen Robinson, and welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. My guest today is Sailor St. Clair, or Stevi Costa. She's the co artistic director of the Noveltease Theatre in Seattle. So let's get into this while my wife is still listening. Hey, Stevie, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Stephen?
I'm all right. Thanks for joining us. This is exciting. I'm a big fan of yours and really wanted to kind of talk to you about your work at the Novelties Theater. Can you tell folks a bit about what you do? Because it's really cool.
Yeah, sure. Um, First of all, thanks for saying you're a fan. We thrive on that on the burlesque side of theater, is hearing that fan feedback. So, Novelties Theater is a literary burlesque company, and what we do is long form plays with burlesque, and we use burlesque much in the way you would use song or dance in a musical to drive the story forward. So every piece of burlesque that we offer has something to do with the narrative. So we're taking a little bit of the elements of contemporary striptease and infusing that with a theatrical form that people are really familiar with. And what I love about this work is that this actually really harkens back to the way that burlesque started in the United States in the 1880s. Most people don't know that. But when that genre came to America, it was all of these all-female acting troupes that would do parodies of classical dramas or political satire, and they would not be using striptease as part of the vocabulary. You couldn't really do that then, but they would often perform in drag, which meant that they would wear clothing that was often a bit more titillating or revealing of the female form than would have been acceptable in the 1880s. So I like to think we're continuing this kind of bygone tradition in burlesque.
That's often awesome. And I've done some work with the Book It Theater in Seattle now since gone, but you guys are sort of doing something similar, which is sort of the adapting books to the stage through obviously your unique lens. How do you choose sort of material that you adapt, and kind of what approach do you take when you're considering something?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do actually pay a lot of, I think, pay a lot of homage or operate in the tradition of Book It, because we too do direct text adaptations. So we use the words on the page. I think our adaptation rules are a little bit looser than theirs are. So we will do things like change pronouns or change verbs to make things fit the mouth of an actor, and we edit pretty judiciously. But to your question about how we choose what we choose. The joke we often tell at Novelties is, how do we take this classic novel and make it more gay? Um, and that has been pretty true of a lot of the work that we've chosen. So we end up selecting things that are only in the public domain, first of all. And that's because part of our mission is about interrogating and reframing, reworking, and reclaiming classic texts. So it's interesting, I think, to go back and take something old and read it and reread it and read it against the grain, or read it with a more contemporary lens, and to think through, what are the possibilities that this offers? Does this text allow for us to create a queer reading or queer understanding? Is that something that comes from the text? Or if we were to do that, is that imposing something that doesn't work with the original intention? So, for example, like we did a production of Northanger Abbey in our very first year back in like 2019, which we chose because most of our company members really love Jane Austen, but we wanted to pick a Jane Austen that was less understood or less well read. And Northanger Abbey has some love triangles in it that I think are really interesting to reframe through cross-gender casting in a contemporary context. And if you read the book, you sort of see that some of the female friendships in that novel are really rife for bringing forth in a more kind of queer forward adaptation. So those are some of the things that we think about, but we often kind of let our company members bring stuff forth to us. If someone says, hey, I'm really interested in this book, and I was thinking about, what does the Odyssey look like if we focus more on Penelope than Odysseus, which was a project we did during the pandemic. We did a dance film of the Odyssey. Or what does it look like to do what does it look like to do Jekyll and Hyde as a trans narrative? That's something that one
Hmm.
of our company members has started to percolate on. How do we do stories about Edgar Allan? How do we weave together a bunch of Edgar Allan Poe stories and transform that into something? So our company members are often bringing us books that they're interested in. And that's really great to see, because it used to be myself and my co-artistic director saying, well, I'm really passionate about this book. What do you all think? And they'd be like, sure, sounds great. So we're starting to entertain pitches from our folks within our company, and sometimes from outside partners as well.
And that's sort of interesting because the idea often with the text, you're sort of deciding, are you sort of doing, are you responding to the text? So, oh, this is somewhat problematic in how it views women or queer people or minorities, and we're going to perhaps comment on that in how we adapt it. Or sometimes they sort of, I've seen interesting things of where it's kind of, well, here's perhaps what the authorial
Mhm.
intent was to sort of tell a romance. Yes, there's a lot of, or something that's funny, and yes, there's a lot of problematic stuff here, but let's peel that away and go to the core. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of get to sort of the story without necessarily having to feel like you have to slavishly adapt it to the stage. I've been some controversy with Roald Dahl's stuff, like with changes made to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because of how the Oompa Loompas had originally been written, and people were kind
Mhm.
of like, no, 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 it has to be this way because that's what he originally intended. It's like, I don't know if he really intended what your audience is going to take, a modern audience is going to take from it, but
Right.
that's often the thing. Like, modern people are watching it, so you can kind of warn them that this is sort of a time capsule, but that's not how people process art, I guess, you know.
Yeah. And there's a fine balance, I think, to that too. In particularly if you're using a medium like burlesque, one thing that I think about a lot is how do you include moments of violence, right? Like or types of conflict that result in violence, particularly violence toward women. Um, since burlesque as it stands now, right, is largely a feminist space. And I think most of the women who revived burlesque in the 1990s would tell you that they're doing this in like a really feminist punk rock kind of way. And so I think about like how you write those moments in, because you still want to, if it's a major plot point. For instance, we did this adaptation of a Dorothy Scarborough novel, The Wind, from 1925, which is just about this woman being absolutely like terrorized, mostly by her own perceptions of loneliness out on the plains of Texas in a town where she is one of two women, right?
Mhm.
And there's not, it was written in 1925, so there's some kind of publisher code things that made it a novel where there's not an extreme amount of violence, but like there is a moment, a climactic moment in that book where a man that she has thinks she has fallen in love with tries to prevent her from leaving the town, and he does so in the novel in a way that is pretty scary, I would feel, to stage. And so we simply chose not to stage it to that degree, because that doesn't really feel great in a burlesque show.
Mhm.
And ultimately, at the end of the book, she kills this guy anyway, so she's going to get her revenge. But we even changed the way that happens, just because we also, I personally I'm not very comfortable with guns on stage, and I feel that that's also a little bit weird in burlesque. In You can do this in a more straight dramatic play to great effect, I think, and there's obviously ways to stage that as well. But we made a few small changes from that, but it still maintains the plot, and it still maintains what the story is trying to do. Because I think for 1925, that is a book that is a feminist text, right? It's about the sort of the wind, this specter of this scary thing is the patriarchy. And that's still true in the version that we did. We just made a couple of small cosmetic changes to make it more palatable to our audience and to a modern audience. So I think what you're talking about, right, is that like it is this balance of how do you maintain what is the story, not necessarily the authorial intent,
Hmm.
but what is the story, and how you can balance that, get those needs of the story against what your audience might be expecting, or how you might choose to care for your audience in those moments.
And the way you approach this, obviously, if you could talk a bit about your background, you have definitely studied both theater and literature. Can you tell folks a bit about your background
Yeah,
and how it kind of applies to
sure.
the work you're
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah. So Sailor St. Clair is the Showgirl Scholar. That's a little hashtag I started giving myself because I began my career in burlesque when I was in graduate school studying for my PhD in English at the University of Washington, which I received in 2016. So I'm a student of American literature. I did the like adjunct professor thing for a while before switching entirely into the nonprofit sector where I reside now. But yeah, I try to approach when I'm working on adapting a text, I'm often thinking about how it functions from a more theoretical standpoint, right? So if I'm talking about the question of how does this work with a queer lens, does it work with a queer lens? What are the perspectives that we as readers bring to a particular text? Um, and how can that continue? How can we manifest that as we bring it forth to the stage? And I think that's a really like lovely and interesting thing about the work of adaptation in particular, because you're always bringing you always have the opportunity, right, to look at the text from different angles and different lenses. And I love seeing adapted work that draws from the language on the page in ways that open up those worlds and allow you to frame things differently, to give different voices to the text, right? Like, to book its credit, I think they always did a really remarkable job in creating great ensembles of characters who could speak these other aspects of the text aloud, which I always thought was really interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and I think we too also get the ability to play with in that who says what, right? What does it mean if you give a line that very famously belongs to one character to another? How can you transform the text in that way?
Yeah, I always thought that was something really cool that Book It would do. Like, this classic line doesn't necessarily have to go to this character. I mean, often it would, but you could kind of, depending on who's adapting it, take different turns with that. And yeah, I mean, part of the cool thing about with literature, especially, is that in its way this historical document of like political, social, pop culture history. I've done some dramaturg work for shows, and it's always great to. It's interesting because when you're sort of doing something that's set, if you're doing the Great Gatsby, it's like, okay, well, here's the 1920s, and here's what's going on, and no one in the room was alive, or certainly not sentient at the time that you are discussing this. But recently, we did something. It was written in about teenagers in the 1990s, and I was a teenager in the 1990s, and you kind of look around and, oh, these people playing teenagers obviously did not exist in the 1990s. They're like suddenly being, you're kind of presenting to them what it was like to exist in that period in a way. Um, and then when you're thinking of adapting it, like, what are ways to convey what this period was like? So you get cool things in set design and cool things of like how a person might have dressed. And I always find that compelling, because the book is often more than just those words, right? Like, what was going on at the time that it was written.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, when we're going way, way, way back to classics, then you get this kind of double framing, right? Where it's what if you do Jane Austen, but you do Jane Austen in a different time period, right? So like
Mhm.
the production of Northanger Abbey I was describing to you, we set that in the 1960s, still in England, but it was so interesting to see these kind of historical resonances between those two periods of time. And the real mechanism we were thinking about there is like, well, in an Austinian world, right, in the Regency period, social dance was so important. And that was the way in which people communicated class, communicated so much about their own status. That is how you found a partner, right, was going to these social dances. And that's such always a plot element in a Jane Austen novel. And so you're kind of limited in thinking about like, well, where, if you were to translate that to another time period, how could you make that aspect of the book make sense? And so we
Mhm.
landed on the 1960s because there was such a big social dance scene in the UK at that time. And then when we made that choice, as we were doing some of the other dramaturgical work on it, while Fosse and I were adapting this piece, we discovered Northanger Abbey is a book about a character who really loves kind of trashy Gothic novels. They were considered trashy at the time. We now consider them classic. She loves Gothic novels, right? And the fun discovery that we made as Fosse is researching social dance and making this choice for his choreography, I was thinking about what's the connection there with reading, this character who's a reader, and how does that track? Well, as it turns out, we learned purely by happenstance, the greatest of happenstances, that in the 1960s, there was a huge revival of publishing Gothic novels under like dime store paperback covers. So they're really cool. You can find like copies of Northanger Abbey, in fact, that have like a very 1960s Gothic painting cover. And that is an effect of the public domain. Those books had been in the public domain for some time, but publishers picked up this idea of, oh, what else can we add to this market of trade paperbacks, which were so big in the 50s and 60s? How can we continue to profit essentially off of stuff that we already have? And so they picked up a lot of these older works in the public domain and just marketed them in this really cool way. So there was this, so it really all ended up making sense because we made one dramaturgical choice and then it filled out the rest of the world. So yeah, I love being able to offer those little bits of history and the little bits of dramaturgical context. I think that's one great benefit we have with like classic novels or anything, even as you were just describing, like we have audience members who don't know what the 90s were like. Which
Yeah,
is, wow, what a trip.
exactly. Well, it's the context, right? So these things are written, and as I know as a writer myself, and you might know as a writer, when you're writing something in that period, you're not necessarily thinking of doing an historical document. You're just sort
Right.
of putting sort of the kind of the setting the stage of what that period is to help people connect with the characters. And when you just sort of say rigidly translate that, then people don't kind of what's going on. Like I legitimately had people once ask me when I was teaching again Gatsby, someone was like, why why are they upset about the heat? Why don't they just turn on the air conditioning? They're rich. And it's like, well,
Mm-hmm.
it's night, there is no air conditioning.
Yep.
Like they'd have no
Mm-hmm.
access
Mm-hmm.
to that. So that the whole motivation becomes like, so you wind up having to sort of think about, well, what is something that connects to people without being told, or you can translate that to the period, as you say, like, oh, social dance was a main part of this thing, we're going to put it in a context that will make a little bit more sense for people alive now watching it. So there's fewer levels or layers rather to get to the story, they kind of understand it. um I think that's often a challenge. I think with Breakfast at Tiffany's, one of my favorite books, because I think
Mm-hmm.
I've more recent versions have tried to really set it in the 40s when the book is written, and I think you just wind up having an actor trying to connect with someone her grandmother's age instead of
Mm-hmm.
that's written to be a modern woman, like that's who Capote was writing. So that's always the fascinating thing of like, how do you connect with audiences in the way that they're gonna like relate to. So speaking of audiences, theater right now has been in a bit of a pickle since our the big shuttering in
Mm-hmm.
2020. Um, can you tell us a bit about that experience for yourself? What what, when the when the lights went out, and then I think now we can sometimes think, okay, well, this was a 2 year period and we saw it through as a 2 year period, but we didn't really know what was happening like at the
Right.
time. So can you tell us a bit about your experience with that?
Oh yeah, yeah. We were gearing up to do Sherlock Holmes, and we all went to rehearsal on when it was a Wednesday, I believe, Wednesday, March 11th. We got into the rehearsal room, and that was the day that Governor Inslee shut down all public assembly, and we said, okay, well, this is terrible. This sucks. We're 2 weeks away from opening. We posted a postponement notice. Hopefully, we thought, yeah, April, that'll work. And then we posted another postponement notice. Yeah, July, that'll work. That'll be great. And then by July, we realized the uncertainty in which we were living, and we, just kind of postponed that show indefinitely. And we did get to do it again, actually mount that in 2022. But yeah, those 2 years were weird 2 years, like a lot of people at Noveltease, we kind of did the initial online pivot, and we were reading, as many actors did. And we were like, we're actors, let's read stories online. So we did that for a little bit. And then we did a web series for a little while where we were showcasing individual acts in conversation, more like a behind the actor studio, inside the actor studio kind of thing, where we would have people pair an act with a piece of literature and then talk about that, package that as a web series. We made a dance film that was really hard. Never going to make a movie ever again. That's why we do stage stuff, because movies are hard. And then eventually kind of, the end of 2021, we're able to start getting back into doing some live performance stuff. But I think it was just really challenging. It was really personally challenging for me, mentally, as I'm sure it was for many people, to not have the creative outlet that I rely upon, which needs a live audience. I was also still teaching at the time, and really put into perspective for me that part of what I need as a teacher is also that energy exchange that you get in person with other people. And teaching to a wall of black Zoom screens made me feel very sad. And probably, I'm sure my students were also very sad on the other side of those black Zoom screens, which is why they didn't want to show me their faces. I get that. But I couldn't turn my camera off too. So that was not a fun time. And coming back has been weird. I'm sure that every other theater maker you've spoken to has talked about how challenging it's been to rebuild audiences. And I see that in straight theater. I see that in this little burlesque hybrid that I do. And I see it in burlesque too. I mean, the thing that I am not seeing come back right now is the monthly bar show. I think folks who are trying to do those really lower production value, which is not a comment on the quality of the individual acts. It is more a comment on the quality of what you put into the production, right? Those are really seeming to struggle unless they have a particular experiential element. The one show I know that does really well every single month is burlesque karaoke, because people want the experience of being able to sing karaoke while someone dances. That's fun to them, right? And I read a lot, right? In Wall Street Journal did this piece a while ago that's really just lodged into my brain about the value of experience, and what people are willing to pay for is not just the art itself. They want an experience that goes with it, right? And so I'm curious to see, for instance, the next evolution of our friends at Cafe Nordo, now Nebula. I'm really curious to see how they might pick up on that trend of offering these kind of experiential opportunities. But I think too, that's part and parcel of how people make choices about when they're going to go out, right? What I'm seeing both in my own audiences and in other theater audiences is that people want to feel like they're being taken care of, which is a front of house thing. It's about the way that your front of house staff interfaces with them. It's about the communications they receive in advance of the event. They also care about the quality of the art. They want to know that that's going to be a good experience. But all of that, right, is packaged under that word. They're less likely to take chances on stuff if they don't think they're going to have a good experience. So I think it really behooves us all as theater makers, especially people who produce work, to think about that whole package, right? That matters. That's what people care about right now. And I think you can do it simply, and I think you don't have to spend a ton of money on it. But showing our patrons that we want to offer them a nice experience by thinking about some of their needs is one way in which we can do that really simply.
And that's such a good point. I think it's part of a reckoning that theater had been having even prior to COVID was sort of, people would often say, and I would talk to artistic directors, and it's like, oh well, the young folks want to play video games and they want to see Marvel movies, don't want to come to see the theater. It's like, well, no, I think what they want specifically is an experience to be connected. Is one reason why sporting events were still doing pretty well. And I think if you create this sort of barrier, right, the idea that theater is come in, sit down, shut up, be very, very quiet, turn off your phones. Of course, you don't want people talking on their phones, but like if again, it's
Mhm.
about like this sort of rigid experience and sort of a barrier, and you watch something, then it, well, especially when people were doing that at home, then it's like, well, why should I leave? Right? Like I can
Right.
just stay at home and watch on a screen, because then it's still, that barrier is still there. And when, I was working on the first show that Nordo brought back, the Curator and Curator experience, and some of my friends who had seen it, they were excited because it's like, oh, this is the first time I've seen my friends in this capacity in a year. We're seated at a
Mhm.
table, we're getting drinks and having dinner, and then seeing being entertained. And that specifically was what people had missed the most, because there was still, we were depressed and in our robes watching old movies and watching, we were still being entertained, but in
Mhm.
the way of a shared experience. That's what people fundamentally missed. And I think theater that is offering that will do well, I think. And I think burlesque also, those shows, that is something, again, a fun experience, something I can't just get from watching on TV, right?
Yeah, definitely. Oh, yeah, burlesque is like not good on TV. It really has to. You got to have the. You really have to have the audience there for that. But yeah, that you collective experience. You added another word that I think makes the phrase even more impactful, right? Like that's why we all want to go. We want to go to a big concert tour. We want to go to a sporting event, and the reasons we want to go to that is because you can say, "Oh wow, yeah, I was at that thing. I was part of this collective experience."
Mhm.
And I do think that burlesque offers that. I'll say, there are burlesque festivals and like regular shows that do really well. The big holiday burlesque shows like Jingle All the Gay, right? That's Kitten and Lou's show. That always does really well. And it does really well because it is part of people's regular holiday tradition. They look forward to it. It invites newcomers every year. People who have seen it before will bring new friends, right? Those 10 people will tell 10 people. And then down the road, you're selling out more and more shows. And that's because it's a fun experience. Everybody loves to go out around the holidays because that's fun. It's fun to see your friends around Christmas time, whatever your holiday of choice is, winter season. Everybody loves that. It's the time where we get together with folks. And so I think you're really right that it is about how you're connecting with people and why we feel we need that so much. And the difference is how we're marketing our shows and how we're talking about our shows is how are we going to offer that experience when it's not something like Beyonce's in town for one night, right? Like,
Oh yeah. Well, or something that people want to come back for, like as you said, being taken care of. It's like, I'm gonna see my friends go to this place. They go to Noveltease every Friday or every Saturday, and regardless of what's even playing, or even if I'm seeing the same thing or something different that I, I don't know what I'm going to see, it's this experience. At least I know I'm going to have a good time. From when I walk in, I know there's almost a familiarity, right? Like,
yeah,
get my drink or whatever, and it's like hanging out. And I do think, because again, if you think about sporting events, obviously they're not, you don't know who's going to win, you don't, but they know sort of what the, how it's going to play out, how the sort of shared experience will be. So I think
yeah,
that's something that you kind of hope theater will start to do more of. I just, we talked about theaters are struggling. We're trying to like, how do you get through this period? You don't kind of want to be, and we've known theaters that have suffered during the transition period, right? So, is there anything that your organization is doing to try to kind of get through this period, be it the next year, 5 years or so?
yeah. That's a really great question. I think some of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to grow. And when we started, we were doing like 2-night runs, which is wild because you hear that and you go, oh no, but you rehearsed for 6 weeks. Why would you do that? And it's because we were operating originally on a burlesque model where even if you were doing a scripted burlesque play that was like based on a piece of pop culture, this would have been maybe 10 years ago or so at the height of what I would call the nerdlesque movement, where we were all like, yes, let's do an episode of Futurama, but with burlesque. We did that. But we did that twice. But those were really like a little loosey-goosey, right? And they're not as tightly rehearsed or as tightly choreographed as a novelty show is. So, but we were still operating kind of on that thinking and have slowly been transitioning ourselves over the 5 years that we've been operating, with the 2-year hiatus in the middle there, to be operating more on a theatrical model where we are offering people more opportunities to see our work by expanding our runs. We're on like 2 weekend runs right now, and we hope in a couple of years, in the next 5 years, to like be up to 3 doing full length theatrical runs so that all of our rehearsal really pays off. But with that, you know, the thing we would hear from our audience members in those first couple of years was, oh no, like I'm out of town this weekend. I really want to come, but I'm going to miss the show. And now it's funny is that the more chances you give somebody to see something, more reasons they seem to find opportunities to not see it. Right. So I'm still hearing the same thing. And I don't know if that's a problem I can solve, but also with more opportunities to fill seats, right? That means there's more opportunities to invite people to experience our work. And that allows us to continue to make it more accessible. That's one tenet of the way that our ticketing philosophy operates, right? We have a lot of pay what you choose tickets. We have no limit on those. Sometimes burlesque shows can be really, really expensive and cost prohibitive. And I like that I can offer burlesque experiences that happen in a theater, which makes them accessible to people who are 18 plus, because I also think it's important for young folks to have places to go to see cool stuff that's not a bar. And I like being able to have a wider number of seats so I can offer tickets at a variety of prices so that anybody can see it. And you know, what I hope is that we can continue to grow that and keep that bar, remove that barrier, right? So that it's an art form that feels accessible. And Fosse likes to say that we're kind of a gateway drug for like theater people who are burlesque curious to then maybe find their way into seeing more cabaret style burlesque shows. And I think it also works the opposite way too, where we have the opportunity to kind of cross-pollinate and take people who have only seen burlesque, introduce them to theater, and then maybe they go, oh, some of you are also acting in straight plays. Well, I would like to go see Missy Lane, yes, act in an Agatha Christie down at Renton Civic Theater. So that's sort of where we hope our work sits. Like, I'm really just interested in doing some cross-pollination and working through this kind of hybrid model to enhance both aspects of this art form that I've fused together. I don't know how else I would answer your question about what we're hoping to do or combat that audience issue. I think a lot of theaters, I think, are just predicting generally that it's going to take another 5 years to get back to anywhere near pre-pandemic levels. But for me, I'm like, I've got nowhere to go but up, right? I started small, so.
Yeah, and I tend to be of the opinion that things can never really go back. You can only kind of go forward. And I think you're doing the work of investing in future audiences. And thankfully, I think getting younger audience, a place for 18 and above to go, that's not a bar. Because again, it goes to the idea of where seeing theater is a place that I want to go to hang out. I want to go to hang out with my friends. That builds a sense of, you know, every time you open a show, you're sort of in a traditional model, you're almost building from the ground up. You have your subscribers, but you're still building from the ground up. And if you had something where it's just novelties is where my friends are, and that's where I'm going to go, you sort of have a bit more of your audience than you would an additional model. And I'm doing that with some theaters here in Portland as well. I've tried to like get the idea of, I'm not a religious person per se, but like in the church aspect, when you're a member of a church, it's your community. It's about that's where you go and that's where you hang out. And I think that's something that I think theater has to do. I don't think it can compete with streaming or digital
Mhm.
with like a traditional sense of getting a story, because especially for younger audiences, they're going to be like, I can get this story at home, right? And so why should
Mhm.
I? And I think and I really like that you are addressing why to come out. Why should I come out and get that experience? Um, what about where you are
Mm.
specifically
Mhm.
in Seattle? Because obviously, one of the challenges have been like struggles, the downtown Seattle area, particularly just even with people working remotely. So you have fewer people staying in the area
Right.
afterwards. So can you speak to that a bit about where you
Yeah.
are, how that's been a challenge or not?
Yeah, we're a resident company at Theater Off Jackson, which is down in the ID. And the thing that you were just saying about like a congregation, right? Or the idea that when you go to the theater, that's you're hanging out there and that's where your friends are. When you were describing that, I was like, that's every show I've ever been to at Theater Off Jackson. And maybe that's because, right, I'm friends with many of the other resident company folks who produce there and a lot of the other co-producers. And I have a long-standing association with TOJ as a former board member myself. But it's funny, like when you go to a show at TOJ, you go because you're like, oh yeah, oh hey, oh there's my friend, hey hey hey. It's just the way that all of the artists who produce there seem to manage to kind of cross pollinate their audiences even, and I think TOJ could continue to do that a lot more. I know a couple of the other resident company folks. I'm trying to do that with Jasmine Joshua at Reboot in particular. We kind of co-advertise in each other's programs at the very least, and um, we've started a process of inviting Reboot folks to come see our shows and vice versa. So we do little like um, preview nights where we trade, since we don't often get to overlap otherwise. But TOJ really does feel that way. But it's not like an area of the city that has a huge amount of foot traffic. And the good, I'd say the benefit is that the ID is really close to the light rail. That's a thing I always amp in our pre-show communications. I'm like, just take the light rail here. It's so easy to get here. By the way, there's a bus that'll drop you off right out front. Um, and I think that helps bring people in for that particular event. It's the same track they would take, right, if they were going to go down for a sporting event. The ID also has really great food, so there's an extra incentive to make an evening out there, which I also put in my pre-show communications. We will usually name like 2 or 3 restaurants that are nearby that we'd like to highlight, just to convince people to come and spend more time in the ID. And I think TOJ's new leadership is also trying to go in that direction of really centering that theater within the international district community and being able to use the theater as a way to um, drive customers toward CID businesses, right? Like that's a good thing for everybody. If we want to treat the arts as an economic driver, we all need to be in partnership with that message and to be able to share our spaces and our community with other businesses in the area. That makes them value having us there. And I can see a lot of opportunities to strengthen those relationships just all over town, really. But I like the direction that I think TOJ is hoping to take with that. So that's where we're at. But I mean, I'm also saying this, and I feel like I should. I'm saying this in a very positive light, but I feel like I should also say that people have some negative perceptions around safety in the ID, and I can't say that those are unfounded. But I do think that if there's more activity, right, and more reasons to be there, that always tends to improve safety in the
Absolutely.
neighborhood, right? Like if more
Yeah.
people are about, that helps. And the ID was one of the places where I think there were a lot of safety issues that cropped up during the pandemic, and I'm glad to see that that's kind of starting to rectify. Not for obvious reasons that have to do with shitty, horrible, racist things. A lot of businesses were negatively impacted in the CID, and it's really sad because it's such a great place.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time to chat about novelties and what you've been doing. It's so very exciting. I'm just glad you're back, and people should check out what you do. It's great. And can you tell folks where to find you on either
Mhm.
the internets as well?
Yeah, definitely. We are novelteasetheatre.org. That is Noveltease theater with an RE.org. We're also on Instagram at Noveltease Theatre, same spelling. You can find us on Facebook in pretty much the same way. So that's where we are. And you can usually find me personally through those avenues as well. But I am on Instagram as at Sailor St. Clair. If you want to see my burlesque stuff. And if you want to see just pictures of my cats, my other daytime persona is at Stevi Costa. And that's STEVICOSTA.
Well, thank you so much again, and we'll definitely keep in touch, folks. Go check out Sailor at all those places, and like, share, subscribe, and spread the word. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Stephen.